So I want to start off by asking a question related to like your background. You have done engineering, economics, you worked in hedge funds, venture capital, you've done some government advisory, interests in philosophy, AI. So how do you usually introduce yourself at like a dinner party?
That varies widely depending on the dinner party, quite frankly. Not that I go to so many, but still. I think it like depending on sort of which through line you want to take, one of the through lines that exist throughout is technology, which helps whether you're trying to build it or advise on it or trying to figure out what's going to come next, which exists pretty much throughout most of those little bits and pieces. And the second part of that is like figuring out how different facets of that actually impact the real world, which helps. I mean, economics is a big part of that, right? I mean, why the reason I went to study it in the first place was because I thought I wanted to have a sense of how the world actually changes or is affected by the actions that we take. And it seemed like the right thing to study in order to be able to get a sense of that. And same for many different parts of the professional career. So depending on the audience at the dinner party, it changes a little bit, or I push up or down specific facets. But the broad fascination with technology or with like complex systems in general definitely comes through, regardless of which facet I'm talking about.
And how do you think these multiple backgrounds has impacted the way you think about things?
I think different subjects or different topics, different ways of working, different geographies, even for that matter, are all like you can think of them as different lenses that you can put against a particular question. These are like what, I think in Charlie Munger kind of talks about this, right? Like you have to have various different lenses that you can bring up and use at any given point. So it's like expanding your toolkit in terms of how you think about the world. I think that is helpful sort of both instrumentally because you're now able to kind of answer or ask certain questions that you wouldn't have been able to do otherwise. But it's also useful sort of intrinsically, right? I mean, it's a good in and of itself because you feel like anytime you want to answer a certain question or ask a certain question, you can draw on a much larger array of sometimes metaphors, sometimes facts, sometimes anecdotes, sometimes like scientific principles that might apply from different domains. And you can at least think about things a little bit more holistically so you're not stuck in a local minima. Now, is it helpful? Is a much harder question to answer because that's like a counterfactual type question. But I personally think that it's amazing because it's one of the few ways that you can actually take joy in life. You want to have as many different tools in your toolkit as possible. So depending on the question, you can pull one out and kind of figure out different ways of thinking about the problem. Because otherwise you're kind of stuck in the same few questions that everybody else has asked, and that's not particularly exciting.
Yeah, that makes sense. You're currently building AI platforms that don't suck. So, like, what do you think makes most AI platforms like suck today or not good?
Some of that is marketing, but like I think AI platforms basically have this broad couple of different types of them, right? I mean, maybe just a step back. I think a key problem that actually exists is that a large number of them are still relatively hard to use, depending on what you want to use it for. So inference has become somewhat easier, especially if you want to use chat type interfaces. But anything sort of slightly more complicated you want to do, it's still not super easy or straightforward. Like if you wanted to use a set of data that you had lying around and you want to kind of mess around with it, play with it, fix it, train an RL model on top of one of the existing ones and then deploy it internally. That's not a problem that is trivially solved today, even though it feels like we are at the cusp of being able to trivially solve one of those problems, because effectively that's what we would want to do going forward. Solving that, I think, is a personal pain point. I would really like there to be a nice solution that exists, but like I also think genuinely it's one of the bigger problems that we can solve. So the broader answer to that question is like suck here is a stand-in for the fact that if you like messing around with, I don't know, name your favorite poison, AWS configurations or setting up, a particular form of actually making sure that your code can run for yourself, you might enjoy it, right? But for a large number of people, sometimes me included, like I don't necessarily want to spend equal or more amount in environment setup. I want my stuff to actually work. I want the purpose of doing something like this is the end goal, where I get something back that I can hopefully make use out of. it bleeds in, the questions do bleed into each other, but solving that, I think, is one of the things that will have to be done in the next several years. Hence, I'm trying to play a small part in that.
And I think you're working at, you're involved with Bodo.ai. Is it solving that problem?
Yeah, so Bodo started out solving a different but related problem, which was that data processing, if you want to do large scale, sort of anywhere, is actually really hard to do, especially if you want to do it just in Python or in your core language. So they started out by saying, hey, if you kind of want to solve that today, like your options are you got to go use Spark or you got to go use some sort of fairly complicated setup. But Python's pretty powerful. Not just that, if you use MPI method, like if you can auto-parallelize a bunch of questions, then if you had a compiler, then you would be able to massively speed up regular old Python if you want to use it for data processing. That was the kind of hypothesis. And that hypothesis is relatively true. Lots of caveats and sort of edge cases, but like broadly that hypothesis is true. Now, if you think about sort of what it takes to actually make a proper, one of the AI platforms similar to what we were talking about, this is an essential component of what is required. And it's not just for AI, right? It's much broader. It's for any data processing stuff that you would need to do. But it is a necessary component of what is required if you want to build one of these things. So if you are able to kind of manipulate data sufficiently well that you are able to build the building blocks of sort of wanting to go train your own model, you can mess around with that, the data loader. There's a set of tools that you can actually link together and you can enhance sufficiently that you are able to solve that. Anyway, I don't know whether that made a huge amount of sense, but that's at least the theoretical foundation behind where we started and how we're thinking about solving this issue.
How do you view India? Like, where does India stand in the global AI landscape, and what do you think its advantages or challenges are?
I think that's a much bigger question. Why don't I take a slice and then maybe you can kind of poke more. I think in the first few waves of various types of startups and entrepreneurship, et cetera, that came about, I think the largest chunk in India were in the real industries where you had resource constraints or governmental intervention actually being useful. So financial services, oil, ports, whatever, all of the normal companies that you would buy if you were to go into Nifty or whatever. Then the actual startup wave that came, kind of the first wave effectively thought of, whatever, grocery delivery or transportation, the whole asset light marketplace kind of models became a far more popular because it seemed like the right place for you to kind of integrate. And the third sort of wave, which was only, it's still young, was to kind of get more into the SaaS world or like the fintech world in order to be able to kind of actually deliver globally useful products, which there aren't that many of just yet, right? There are a few that we can kind of think of, in the API world or whatever, but it's still not like there's some amazing success stories in India for India, like Zerodha, but it's not exactly globally known brand names. And I don't think the latter is because of anything like, it's not because of lack of talent. It's not even because of lack of ambition. It's just like, context shifting from country to country is hard at the best of times. And like if you're betting bigger in India, you kind of think like, okay, where else can I go? I can go to Southeast Asia, but each individual country is fairly different languages, complicated. You can go to Europe, roughly similar problems, or you can come to the US, where you kind of are a much larger, much harder market to compete in some sense. People do it, but like it's not a super common thing. All of this is based to say that like in the AI domain, one observation, at least that I had, is there is a extremely large number of very talented folks who are actually working in this from India. They are naturally constrained by resources, if you want to call it that, like in terms of number of GPUs. If H100s are much harder to come by. I don't even really know whether that is a easily solvable problem, considering it's a worldwide shortage and everybody has the same issue. So the question to me is a little bit like, there's on the one hand, there's this whole thing of, should we build models specifically for the country? And I don't really know whether that's useful. I keep going in two minds about it, because if the logic is that large foundation models are utilities, then sure, it only makes sense to build it if it's hyper local, right? Like, if it is maybe specific to a language or something. But what we've seen is that larger models learn everything equally. So it almost doesn't make sense to kind of do these things country by country. What does make sense is everything else that you can kind of build on top. And whether that is open source contributions or whether that is, building things for building the entire application layer that comes on top, I feel there is an enormous opportunity there. Because effectively you can sit in Bangalore, you can build it, and there's no reason that somebody in San Francisco shouldn't be able to use it, because everything goes via the same central clearinghouse as Hugging Face anyway. So where you upload from has almost no relationship to where you end up using it. I mean, if there's one big thing that we can see from, people using Quen or DeepSeek or whatever, it's the fact that the creation is now severed from the usage. Right? Like, I mean, unlike it wasn't true for software at all, because you would not necessarily download and use a piece of software that was developed somewhere else. Maybe privacy security concerns, more importantly, the context might not be same. In fact, there were very few that leaked through, right? I mean, the ones that leaked through did succeed. TikTok leaked through, but arguably it came after they bought Musical.ly. It becomes a more of a complicated kind of dynamic there. I think with AI, there's a lot more potential, is my hypothesis. But I don't know what the ground truth and reality is. I mean, I can only see it sort of one step removed at this point.
Yeah, no, I think what I've seen differently is people are a little bit more optimistic about AI. They don't hate it as much, I would say, like other parts of US or Europe too. I mean, the mass public, they view it in a way that, okay, it's a helpful tool, we can use it. So there is, I think, more positivity surrounding it compared to perhaps other countries. And regarding building our own model, I think that came into picture after DeepSeek, because prior to that, I think many were just focusing on the application, just building on top of that. But then once DeepSeek was able to build something so cheaply, I think India shifted focus and wanted to build its own product. But how do you view this new Manus AI that launched and the hype surrounding it?
I mean, I think I did a pod with like Jordan of China Talk with like Dean and Sean. I think the short version is, let me step back. I think for various reasons, what you said is correct, that people are far more positive because of DeepSeek and other reasons. But I also think people are far more positive about building stuff like this in India in any way, or in developing countries. The West primarily has this fear of a large number of things that need to be built that either pulls them back from building enough application layer, or it pulls them back from, in terms of safety concerns or whatever. So the question to me is a little bit that, like, the interesting thing about Manus is not a product that should have come out of China. Does that make sense? It's not doing anything earth-shattering. Like DeepSeek was a true question mark. Like, how did they do it? Mega geniuses, whatever, writing PTX, and Jack Clark's phrase, right? Unfathomable geniuses sitting in somewhere. I mean, true or not true, I don't know. But like, at least there's a different kind of spectacle. With Manus is a little bit like, this is a product that should have been built by somebody in YC like a year ago. But it wasn't. And it wasn't, I think, for two reasons. Number one is that the labs, the large, well-resourced labs, keep saying that anything that you create similar to this, our next model basically is going to just take over. So you have no chance. Correctly or wrongly, they have said that explicitly and implicitly many, many, many dozens of times. And number two is that, like, everyone is kind of AGI pilled, right? The assumption is that once you create the machine that can do everything, then there is no point in you messing around with trying to do small things here and there. I don't think either of those things are necessarily true, but an interesting outcome of this has been that, like, when you look at the products that you normally use, they're extraordinarily fragmented. Like, some of them can use web and some can't. Some of them can write Python code and execute, some can't. Some of them have vision, some don't. Some you can upload different types of documents, some you can't. Like, the capability frontier is extraordinarily jagged. And these are not jagged because you can't do it. These are jagged because the labs who are kind of building these things have created a jagged frontier, because they don't need to go out there into the real world and compete, right? I mean, if you want to use ChatGPT, Claude, DeepSeek, whatever, you're just going to use whatever they gave you, and they only need to compete with each other. If Claude doesn't have, web search built in, you don't particularly care whether you if you're OpenAI, you're not getting pushed to release to release the next version. So with this as context, when I look at Manus, I'm like, they used existing models, closed source in terms of Claude, some open source, Qwen fine-tunes. The browser that they did was from a YC company. But effectively, they went entirely deep into trying to see whether they can create a generalist agent. So they went into the product realm and actually pushed people into creating a better product. And if you think about the competition that actually exists here, like Operator from OpenAI or like the computer used from Claude, these suck, right? I mean, they're nice demo-y things, but you're not going to use them for anything real, or not really. Really like the fact that they pushed, or they are pushing, the product frontier forward. I would imagine we'll see a whole bunch of like these types of startups push in this direction, which I think is essential if you want to actually push the capability frontier forward. Not because they're building better and better models, but like they're trying to actually use the models better. That's all.
And I mean, there's a lot of focus on safety as well, which I've noticed that perhaps is not as much in India and probably in China. So, which is probably a good thing, but I think that also has an impact. But
I
speaking
would
of
agree
AI,
with that, because like the safety thing there's a long overhang of this history of people working on this, partly because of, the historical reasons of how people got excited about the field, and partially just because of there's an enormous amount of conversation around this individual fact that like safety is paramount, with the confusion of, hey, you don't really know what safety actually means here. I mean, I remember I remember whatever, a year ago or something like that, maybe slightly longer, when people were scared to death of the idea that like an LLM could be given an internet connection, right? Like, I mean, this was a real fear. This was not like made up kind of thing, right? Like it was like, no, that would be extremely dangerous because they will exfiltrate themselves and copy themselves or whatever. And turned out like we gave the best models, ones which are like 10x, 100x better than the ones we had then. And like, we're fine. Because the type of safety you're worried about is very different to the type of safety that actually matters to most people when they use these models in the first place. And you need to believe a whole set of things before you're able to kind of take that leap. But the very fact that many people believe it, and many people who are building these models believe it, mean that they will always be hesitant in terms of putting things forward. Like when Gemini released their flagship, whatever, a year ago, and they were forced due to internal DEI type forces, external forces, I don't know, to kind of mess around with the system prompts so that they would not respond in certain ways, because they were scared to death that like, if it did respond, it would be problematic. And then we have DeepSeek put out there, which is a much better model than any of these ones were, has pretty much no guardrails. Like, yeah, you cannot criticize the Chinese government on the app, but if you download the weights, it does that also. And like, it doesn't matter at all. So it feels like that overhang definitely impacts the way that the ecosystem develops here. So having an external pressure point come in and say like, no, this is bullshit, like you should actually develop better products. Because that's what ultimately normal people would use, right? They need better products. Having a much better model, I think, is already hitting the point where if I release another better model, most people either might not be able to tell the difference, or it might not actually matter that much. I think products matter, man.
I think you're right on that. Products is what ends up getting used, and there's a lot of discussion around safety. But where do you stand? Do you like view the future with AI in an optimistic sense, or do you view it with pessimism and like in the doomer category, or how do you see the future of AI?
As the previous answer might have given away, I'm definitely not a doomer. I have many reasons for it, but like to me, the core thesis here is that I think AI is extraordinarily important. I think it'll be super powerful and super useful and perhaps even super disruptive. All of these things are true. But I also don't think that it is the vector by which doom, in the original sense of like, we're all gonna get paperclipped, is gonna come true. I just think that is an extraordinary misunderstanding of how technological evolution happens in the first place. Like to my sense, even if next year or whatever Gary Marcus gets proved right and we all like deep learning does hit a wall, we still have created enough value for enough time that it's going to be extraordinarily useful from now to forever. Because the implementation of the AI that we already have has barely started. We kind of have the closest we've got to is like OpenAI signing like large enterprise deals with like Eli Lilly or whatever. And primarily that's to use ChatGPT, the enterprise version, internally. So it's not, we're still very early in the how to scratch the surface. So I am very, very optimistic.
Yeah, that makes sense. But I think at a company and org level, the implementation is a little slow. But when I look at individual use, at least here in India, many people use it quite often, for their daily tasks, productivity, from interns to like professionals. It's quite well adopted.
I think what you're suggesting is like, this is one of the questions that exist of, is it going to increase individual productivity or company productivity? They're obviously related, but if everybody uses it for their own jobs and makes it better, that's amazing, right? Because suddenly like you get to work whatever, half the time or a quarter of the time and actually deliver the same benefits. But it's an individual thing. It's on you, right? I mean, you have to use it. You use it to write your emails or write your code or whatever it is. That's totally fine. From a company level, it's different. From a company level, they have to answer questions like, how do we change the processes such that we can put a 90% reliable agent which can solve this particular problem or job that this person used to do. And then you learn things like, you know what, Rohit does these enormous bundle of tasks. These 90% of them can be done by, this AI agent once we train it to 90% accuracy. But that doesn't mean that like you can reduce Rohit's time by 90% necessarily, right? It doesn't go one to one. So then you got to retool the processes inside the company and the place such that you are actually able to solve that in the first place. So it's a little bit of a loop that you inevitably kind of get stuck in. And that requires a lot more effort before you're able to penetrate this sort of much wider array of economy. But the fact that individuals are already using it is a perfect case in point to demonstrate that it's not going away. Do you know what I mean? Like that the boom is inevitable, because all of these people who are using it, suddenly if tomorrow you said, poof, it vanished, you're not going to be able to use it again. I mean, they'd revolt because now they're used to it.
And you become so used to it. Like now I can't imagine going back to like a pre-chat GPT era or not having these tools. You become so dependent on it in some ways. With companies, at least in my view, they are a little slow, I think partly to do with also data. Like many of them are very concerned with what happens to the data and maintaining confidentiality and how data will be processed. So I've seen slower implementation, one of the reasons.
Yeah, I think, like, look, those are important questions to
Valid.
answer, but those are also like engineering empirical questions to answer. Do you know what I mean? Like, there's no philosophical debate here. It's like, hey, I really care about my data privacy. How do you solve it? Like, you got to figure out how to exfiltrate it from a network, or like, if not, you got to kind of put your model in other people's or private, whatever. I mean, dedicated data center, there's a bunch of different ways you can solve for it, but like, it's an engineering solution at that point. There's no philosophical debate about if it's useful or not. We are arguing over the price. We are no longer arguing over whether the good is important for you or not.
Yeah.
And companies will always take much longer, because companies are these extraordinary, intricate interconnections of like thousands and millions of different facets kind of touching to. It's like a mini economy in itself, right? So if suddenly you said, hey, everybody, go use AI or to replace whatever, you can't just do it easily. You have to like tease out which things you want to do and build for it, which is kind of interesting.
And there are also like layers of approvals, a lot of management, a lot of discussions and approvals. So it's a bit slower. Um, what are some ways that you currently use AI that are perhaps underrated or overlooked?
I don't know what's underrated or overlooked anymore, is kind of what I feel sometimes, because I'm also in my Twitter bubble or group chat bubbles where everybody uses AI. But I'll give you a couple of them and you tell me whether they're underrated or not. I think one way might be that I actually use AI for almost everything. Everything. Um, I mean, with code, of course, to understand it, to write it, to convert it from one format to the other. Like if I want a markdown file to understand a repository, I would rather use AI. Like any conversion, understanding of something for YouTube. If I don't think I watch YouTube anymore, I usually just paste in the link and try to understand what the key points are before I need to figure it out. Any book that I'm reading, any article that I'm reading, any scientific paper that I'm reading usually gets interrogated with an AI, either on the side or otherwise, or I ask it like, is it worth my reading XYZ sections before I kind of jump in, which kind of dramatically expands the scope of what you can and cannot read. Comparative analysis, if you want to throw in a bunch of documents and ask amongst for connections, which is super important, sort of both from a professional side as well as from a personal side. Trip and travel planning, interrogation kind of questions, medical questions, an enormous chunk of medical questions of any sort. For me, kids, parents, whatever. Like, I mean, it is the first port of call to kind of answer any of these things. I use deep research quite a lot, even for trivial things, just because I kind of like it. And it's like, it gives you a nice tabular format. So you can ask all sorts of weird questions and get pretty interesting responses depending on what you want. It's especially interesting if you ask it to kind of do analysis on, not just like technical topics, but you can ask it sociological questions or trends in literature or analyze all of Kafka's books or whatever. You can pick and choose what you want it to do, but you can kind of do that. What do I not use it for? I suddenly find myself not using too many image generation type of things. I played around with it quite a lot in the middle, but then I don't know whether the novelty wore off or whether I don't find particularly something that excites me, but I don't really do that much. Image, even the video gen, I kind of play with a little bit, but like I just want to know what's going on. I do not use it, if that makes sense. I think effectively, it has integrated itself into almost every part of what I do normally, including curiosity stuff. Like if I have any question, 90%, 99%, I would usually just go and ask one of the models. And it's a very vibe check of which model I want to use what, or sometimes it's many of them. And then I compare the first answer before choosing which one to dive into. And then you can just have a conversation with it for a little while. And then you either learn something, know something, come out with a book to read, whatever, whichever combination this is, it's a useful exercise. And then you can choose, hey, what do I want to do with it? Do I want to continue this chain of thought? Have I satisfied my curiosity? Do I want to go into the next thing, etc., etc.?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I also use it quite a lot for these things. And I think what these are some people have enabled AI so much in their lives where they use it so often, but a lot of people haven't. Like many people, while they are using it at an individual level, they're just using it for basic things like writing something. They haven't really, gone in depth and doing it in so much detail, like many people, I think hyper users or pro users are.
Yeah, I
And
think, I don't think I actually ever have used it to write an email. But like, um, I mean, mostly because I don't know. That's not my gating constraint quite
yeah.
often. But I'm just looking at sort of a couple of the last ones. There was like some roadmap item stuff. I was trying to figure out some investment strategy questions, historical, evolutionary shift. I had this long conversation about wage economics. Like you can really go very deep into each one of this is like a very long conversation. Some of them with multiple inputs from like whether it's mini high, then O1 Pro, then 4.5, etc., etc. Some of them are just funny stuff that you can mess around with. Like 4.5 is really good at writing. So I use it for any jokey stuff or like anything to do immediate analysis. It's really good. So you kind of do that quite a lot as well.
Yeah.
My car had a scratch that I needed to fix. I asked that. Like it's across the board, right? What I'm trying to kind of demonstrate is that it's not like I think about what do I need to ask AI and then go ask it. It's more any question that I have, it's the first default port of call. It's like maybe 15 years ago or 20 years ago, you would think about, you had to think about like, what would I ask Google versus whatever the secondary option there was. But that question doesn't exist anymore. Because like the first point is like you Google, and then you figure out if you want to kind of take a next step and go read a book or whatever the output that, go speak to somebody, like whatever the output of that inquiry is, that kind of comes out as an action. But the initial action is very easy. It's like you have to have a conversation, and in this case, it's just much easier.
Yeah. No. Do you have a favorite model out of all of these that you use?
I love the new 4.5. I really do. It has the correct amount of, I don't even know, like insight to conversational ratio, and it feels reasonably pliable that I can push it in different directions and ask all sorts of different questions, whether it's writing. I was trying to get it to give me a bunch of new mnemonics for the planets in our solar system. But it can also do like, hey, take in these 5 CSVs and do a bunch of these analyses and figure it out and give me back. It's big. It's smarter enough that like the amount of direction you need to give it is much lesser. So I love that. For anything heavy duty, O1 Pro is extraordinarily good. Yes, you have to wait, but it's like really, really good. I love that. For coding stuff, either it's O1 Pro, so for simpler stuff, Mini High, or I love Claude. Everybody loves Claude. And especially if you use it in Claude Code or even otherwise, I think Claude is just wonderful. I think I use it a lot more for this. It used to be before that, like I used Claude more for also regular conversational stuff. But for interrogating ideas and things like that, it's pretty good at analyzing stuff. But the tone stuff doesn't really bother me that much. And the new 4.5 is very good anyway. So I kind of use that a lot. For anything multimodal, I use Gemini quite a bit. I feel I'm one of the few people who do. I also use it for like I recently wanted to analyze or understand something about reinforcement learning and like some piece of code or something like that. And I use Gemini for that primarily, just because I initially started because I could just throw in a zip file and ask questions easily. But it's smart enough that like you can actually have a full, proper, detailed conversation about what ifs and counterfactuals, and if you change this, then what would happen there kind of problems. It's not great at writing out full pieces of code that you can copy paste and like try it somewhere else, but like in terms of analyzing, writing documents and stuff, it's really, really good. I don't use DeepSeek that much anymore beyond just testing it out, because I think it's until R2 comes out, it's been overshadowed and we have better models to use with.
Well, that makes sense. I think DeepSeek, what I have found, is a little creative with its answers, at least how I've used it. It tends to give something that the other models don't.
Yeah, I mean, it does think different ways. I mean, the other one that I use quite a lot now is Grok, especially for its deep search or like web search kind of answers. It's really good with that. It is, I don't know whether they've cached a bunch of them, but like it's very fast and is very good.
Yeah. And it handles more sources. Like I've noticed compared to Perplexity, there's like a lot more website visits and searches it does.
Correct. And you can ask it to say like, hey, I have some question about AI stuff, for example, and everything happens on Twitter. So I can say only search X posts and give me the answer. And it's like, it's useful because I can curate the sources just by like asking.
Yeah. How do you think AI will change human creativity? Do you think it's going to redefine it?
I think it'll change it for sure. I mean, there's a singularity point perhaps where if you believe that any model can write anything that humans can write better than humans can write, then there's a singularity point, but beyond which nobody knows. But until that point is hit, if it is ever hit, there's always going to be room for you to actually create something that the models can't. You just have to use them better. So I mean, it's already started changing it. But then to me, like, historically, every single technological achievement has changed the way that creativity has been expressed, right? Like, I mean, camera did that, videos did that, movies did that, games did that. Like, every time something new comes along, we find a different way to actually express the creativity within each other. Some things I think are forever, like novels have survived for 500 years. It's pretty lindy. I think it'll continue to have a way. It'll continue to remain as a popular way to create and disseminate stuff. Is it going to remain the exact same thing? I don't know. But then like novels today are extraordinarily heterogeneous as it is, right? I mean, you have IA and genre fiction, and you have like MFA type fiction. You have metafiction, sort of self-interrogatory type stuff. Like you have such a wide array of avant-garde and regular kind of novels, not to mention all the historical ones, that you never quite know which one of these is likely to flourish. But I'd be long on that, I think. I think in general, I am fairly long on if you're able to use these things properly, maybe you write, maybe you create better stuff, whether that's novels or poetry or books or entirely new art forms, which I don't know what they're likely to be, but it'll be pretty interesting if something comes out.
How do you approach building AI startups? How do you AI, how do you find an idea and what do you choose to build? And has your background in like VC impacted this?
A little bit. I mean, background in VC in some sense is an albatross that you have to kind of get rid of. Like investors are investing is about saying no most of the time, and you kind of go for finding something exceptional. So in that way, like finding an idea might sound similar, but to a large extent, working on any idea is entirely a function of like, do you care about it enough that you can work on it for a couple of years? I think I have kind of almost entirely subsumed any kind of ideas into like that one metric. Because in 2 years, like all sorts of things will happen, right? Better models will come out, competitors will come out. You will think that what you built is useless and pointless. All of those things are true. But regardless of all of those things, do you still care about building this one thing is kind of a super useful metric to figure out whether you'll stick with it. And if you stick with it, I think the chances of success are exponentially higher. So
Well, that makes a lot of sense. You've written a post on like what LLMs can never do, and it was like a popular post of yours. So that was about a year ago. Have your views like changed since you've written that post?
I mean, I have to remember a little bit. I think the reason for the post, or like couple of the outcomes of that post, was, despite the sort of the headline, is that LLMs or transformer-based models are phenomenal pattern recognition entities, right? So if you actually have a amount of data and some patterns implicit in it, then chances are you can teach a model to be able to do it. That's point number one. Number two is that there's a large number of things where you need enormous amount of iterative reasoning steps, like playing, the simplest version would be playing cellular automata or like Conway's Game of Life. The same thing exists if you want to play Wordle or you want to create word grids or whatever. These are things that are much easier for humans and much harder for LLMs, right? Like, I mean, generally speaking. Can we create a model which can solve that? And the answer is like, yes, because you can brute force it to kind of solve these problems. But in a normal, effective, real world scenario, we still can't quite do that. So the reasoning models that have come out are much better at kind of figuring out where to guess and therefore answering some of these problems better than they could otherwise. But they're still not, like they still make the wrong kind of mistakes is what I would say. So I think the fact that, like, I think I agree. I think I am still a believer in both of these things. That number one, if you manage to create a data set with sufficient amount of information on something, can you train a model to use it or implicitly learn some of the rules inherent in it? And the answer is yes. At the same time, it does seem true that extreme number of iterative reasonings, like if you wanted to do 1,000 steps back and forth, thinking about 5 different things, like whatever that equivalent is, models are still not very good at it. And to me, this at least hints at some sort of an architectural limitation we'll have to figure out how to break out of. It's not to say we can't or like we won't. I am reasonably confident we will, but it is a different question, is what I'm trying to say. Like, I think it's not the kind of question where the answer is just, hey, run the LLM in a loop. Because LLM in a loop is useful, but like it's also insufficient if you want to do extremely long range planning type tasks, I feel like. Who knows? I might end up being wrong here. The reasoning models have already started coming out and proving that some parts of this are wrong. But I think the way to make it incorrect is perhaps we throw far more RL at it and like teach it with process data that we collect from somewhere, and maybe it manages to figure it out across some domains, but not all domains. You will get a lot more specialist models that will definitely be able to do this. The question is, can you get a general model that is able to do iterative reasoning across an enormous array of tasks? And I think this is a genuinely hard problem. Like, O3 managed to do it on Arc AGI, but it had to spend like an insane number of cycles to be able to solve some of those problems. Because it's not brute forcing it, but like it's effectively going through a very suboptimal process of selecting what it. And I don't know that there is a easy solution to that. I mean, reasoning was a breakthrough in another training time compute. I'm sure there will be others that come through that will help us kind of break this barrier.
You've mentioned the concept of building God in your writings, and can you elaborate on what that means? Is it like building AI related product?
Dude, this is, I think the conceit in AI or anybody who's kind of building AGI is that they're building God. That's why the phrase is so popular, right? Because it's like, if you want to, the worry that we talked about earlier comes from the fact that you build something that is so powerful and so beyond everybody that it can do anything and it can do everything. And therefore, you're effectively at its mercy, hence God. In any realistic kind of scenario, I think, you should replace God with something much more tractable, tangible, and maybe much smaller scale. Because, nobody knows how to, and nobody knows if we can. Nobody knows how we can. This is like an entirely, you should be agnostic about God, is what I would say, across all contexts, but including this one.
No, that is true. Like some people are optimistic. Coming to your blog's name, Strange Loop, like do you see any strange loops in our society, or any strange loop that comes to your mind?
I mean, strange loops are effectively self-referential loops that actually, enable a certain type of pattern to emerge from a bunch of underlying substrates that link with each other. That's one way of thinking about it, right? I think when Hofstadter wrote about this, I think he thought of it in terms of where does the conceptualization of it come from? And it is in some sense a strange loop because it's self-referential. I think it reminds me a little bit of like the Douglas Adams quote about, if anybody figures out what the universe is for, it'll be replaced by something much more inexplicable. And like, then it's like, something this has already happened. So it's like, it's one of those kinds of scenarios. So strange loops in society, if you want to think about it in terms of reflexivity, it exists in like the markets, it exists in economics, it exists in pretty much any complex system that actually talks to itself that you can think about. It exists in like, one way I think about it in the world of startups, just because we talked about it, is that an enormous number of things that we build are things that we build hoping that somebody else has a need for something, that the same thing that we might actually want. Which is if you think about everybody in the world and there are different sort of things that they need, and then if you map those needs, if you could somehow, you can't, you create this mental version of a landscape, like a demand scape, right? I mean, everybody's demand is kind of varyingly portrayed in that. And if you're able to kind of provide some insight into that, or like you're able to solve that, then you can almost think about the different ideas or companies getting created and getting co-evolved with this demandscape as one way that like how evolution actually happens in our world. You have versions of like arthropods rising and falling, or like amphibians rising and falling, and you have dinosaurs rising and falling. You can see this, you can think about it in those terms, that like there exists this demandscape, the landscape itself is co-evolving along with the stuff that actually exists on the landscape. And together, there is some evolution that is happening over a period of time. All of which is to say that like self-referential or intricately linked phenomena is kind of a fact about pretty much everything in nature or everything in human kind of society. And in fact, one of the hardest things that I find in any realm of economics or any realm of like social sciences is to say, isolate the effect of one variable so that you can actually have an interrogatory conversation about it. So if you think about any of the arguments that happen over name an economic concept or sociological concept or psychological concept, almost the entire argument is about, hey, we did this, we saw this. And the other side is like, yeah, but what you saw doesn't matter because of XYZ effects that you did not account for. And no matter how rigorously you test it, you can run RCTs for some stuff, etc. This is a epistemological hurdle that is really hard to jump through, except for very specific situations. And you know what? Just a fact of life. I don't know whether that helps or not, but at least I think of this as suffusing many parts of kind of what we normally do, which is, I don't know, slightly disconcerting at times, but it definitely makes thinking about the world a little bit more fun.
Yeah, it is. very broad. And you've also mentioned in your work pushing the frontier of knowledge forward. So, what does the frontier look like in 2025?
I mean, there's a bunch of work happening in specific fields, like we're pushing it in like material science, or you're pushing it in biotech. I think those are areas where you're going to definitely see, like, we are very much at the cusp and you're trying to figure out what comes next. It's after a long while that we're trying to see it, save for energy, but I don't know that well enough. The other part on the the AI world is like, it is, I mean, we are very much at the year where we're starting to see hints of how we might use the things that we have already built to actually enable this kind of push. So when I wrote Building God, I think one of the conceits that I had, or one of the conclusions that I had, was that remaining AGI agnostic, remaining agnostic as to the fact that we can build this one thing which can do everything, which what we definitely will be able to build enough things such that the individual components can work together and meaningfully push scientific progress forward. And I think that already has proven out to be true. It's slightly earlier than I expected, but like, if you think about Google's co-scientist, that's a perfect example of something where it's not, it's not like some magical new model, right? It's like multiple small models that are all working together in some sort of a cohesive infrastructure framework that they've put together. And the models are smart enough that they don't go completely crazy, but together they do manage to solve ridiculously important kind of problems. They kind of get to the answer. Like they discovered a couple of at least new things that you wouldn't have expected them to. So I think we will see vastly more of those kinds of things. To me, that's a different side to the Manus type productionization of AI kind of question, but it's the same principle where we kind of have these hundreds of building blocks. How can we actually put them together to try and solve this one thing, which is just happens to be a qualitatively different question to how do we put all of these things together to solve everything?
I want to ask you a little bit about India. So I read some of your posts as well. So you mentioned in one of them that India is, it is safe country without having strong legal safety net and a lot of poverty. And, arguably it shouldn't be. There's no real urban crime. Like we don't see a lot of urban crime and it's relatively safe, which I also agree with. Like if you look at the poverty and the legal, it's not, it's, we don't see that level of crime. So why do you think this is the case? What perhaps is the causes for this safety without the legal backing or the presence of poverty?
Okay, this is one of the like enduring confusions that I've had. I mean, it started out like many, many years ago. So I studied in Singapore, and like we used to travel to Southeast Asia from there. And Southeast Asia has similar, in many cases, better economic circumstances than many parts of India had. But like there are parts of, uh, Bangkok or Kuala Lumpur that you probably won't just walk around at night without, without being scared of getting mugged. And I remember this because I was like, I walked around at like night in Bangalore or Bombay and I'm not scared. Do you know what I mean? Now there is a subset of this where you are scared, especially if you're a woman, and I get that. Like, and I'm kind of time boxing it for the time being, but I am suspiciously not as scared of urban crime, of getting mugged if I'm traveling on a train or like whatever it is. And then I spent a bunch of time in Africa, where I traveled to Nigeria for work in the middle for like several months. And this kind of intensified because that you're really scared of a bunch of things, right? Oh, no, you should only go with like your driver. In some parts, you need to have like a Jeep following you or whatever it is. I mean, it's you need to do a whole bunch of infrastructure before you're able to sort of conveniently wander about. And I think about this and I kind of go like, what is the difference? The difference cannot be economic because like that argument doesn't make sense. The difference cannot in some sense be, I mean, I thought in the middle that it might just be like availability of weapons, but I don't really think that is a convenient argument either, because if you want a gun or whatever, I'm sure you can find a way to get it in India. But there is some combination of the fact that there's just a lot of people and there is a cultural taboo against certain types of crime that combined to create this weird pocket where urban crime, the way we would normally think about it in like Paris or London or like, Bangkok, just doesn't quite exist in India. But it's not to say crime doesn't exist, right? There's plenty of crime. Like there's pickpocketing, there's all sorts of ways that people will fleece you. And to me, it's just interesting to see sociologically which types of crimes have actually popped up versus like somebody coming with a knife or a gun and just sort of asking for your wallet just doesn't exist. And I kind of look at that and go like, it's still a poor country and like it's an easy way to do it. If you do it, chances of you getting caught are non-existent as far as I can see, which means like, it's almost like, it's like the economist argument of there is a $1,000 note or whatever lying around on the ground. Like, why is nobody picking it up? It's a good question. I don't have a solid answer, but I think it is cultural to some extent, with the fact that anybody who wants to do that, there's easier ways or like different ways that they think about doing. Even if they want to do crime, there's different ways that they think about doing crime.
I think it's also a little bit more discreet. I mean, whatever crime happens, like they may rob a wallet or they may, go and break into a house, which is low, but it's not so direct where they point a gun or a knife at you. That's very rare, which is very interesting.
There's no reason that should be the case. Like, I mean, there is no logical reason why that would not be a higher ROI way to do crime. It just happens that this particular expression just never kind of took off. So we find this inefficient markets theory, at least insofar as urban crime in India is concerned.
Yeah, no, that is something worth looking into. You've also mentioned India has pretty good institutions, at least far better than it used to have. So like, which institutions do you think are good and and why?
I mean, they've all gotten better, right? Like India always had really good educational institutions and they've continued to be good or better. Public service institutions used to be pretty crap, but like they've also gotten remarkably better. I remember the first time I had to get a passport, it was crazy. And that was like, whatever, late 90s, early 2000s or something, early 2000s, I think. And then the last time I renewed it, it was like seamless. And now it's even more seamless, right? Payments infrastructure used to be the bane of anyone in India, but now it's arguably far better than pretty much anywhere in the West with UPI and whatever. The governmental infrastructure used to be, again, pretty bad, but at least the last time I visited, like the roads have gotten better, the rails are getting better, the flights and airports are magnificent. If you think about sort of what makes a normal kind of life, housing, all of the normal stuff that gets you housing, like whatever, plumbing and all of these kinds of things have effectively gotten better enough so that you can kind of solve for it if you wanted to. Transportation has kind of gotten better and continues to get better. The things that have not particularly gotten better, I feel, are more like setting up companies and things like that, which I hear is still pretty painful. But even that arguably has gotten much better in the last 10 years. So I think this is very much a rising tide lifts everything kind of story, as opposed to we managed to make incremental individual steps in specific things, but like everything else remains pretty crap kind of point of view. I think one of the disagreements or arguments that I have about this when I talk to friends there is that like things are still not great is perhaps true, but they are insanely better than they used to be, and they're on upward trajectory is also true. And you got to kind of keep both of those things in mind at the same time.
That is true. Progress is moving much faster, and I think it's more in the cities though, but you also see some progress in rural part of India as well.
But that's just how these things go, right? Like, I mean, initially you should see it in the cities because that's where most of the people are, like it's the same everywhere in the world. And, you will see progress happening better and faster if you're in London versus if you're somewhere in the middle of like Northern England. You'll see the same thing in like the New York than if you're somewhere in rural Tennessee. I think that divide kind of exists everywhere in the world. The question is more about like the governmental services that they're trying to provide. Have they gotten better? The private services, have they gotten better? And is the trajectory kind of continuing to improve? Pretty much across the board, that's true. Some of this is due to startups, by the way. Like the 10-minute delivery thing kind of works in India today, especially because of lower labor costs. And that makes life remarkably, it makes life great, especially if you are somewhat affluent middle-class person living in one of the cities. Arguably, you have a better life than almost anywhere else in the world. Because things are cheap, things are great, you get insane amounts of variety. But to me, like the single biggest negative is an externality point, which is the air quality. I think that remains the large enough negative to perhaps even impact all of the positives such that you might not want to move back. But everything else, things are getting better. Don't you think?
Yeah. No, I agree definitely. Like when I travel to the US, I do notice that there is a lot that's happening in India, which is sometimes even better and comparable. But the air quality, you're right. Delhi is the worst, but if you look at Bangalore and Bombay, it's not too bad. It's I think below 100 generally here in Bangalore.
I think that it kind of changes, but like, yes, I think Bangalore is perhaps the one that escapes it the most. But like, I think even Bombay, depending on seasons and stuff, it's not great. I think Delhi is the poster child of it actually being terrible, which kind of sucks because I think as a city with NCR, it's actually really, really nice.
Yeah. No, it is good. I did grew up there and it gets a lot more negativity than it should have.
I mean, throughout the time when I was growing up, Delhi was never the place that it made sense for you to kind of spend time just because like the negativity actually was pretty crazy. But like now, at least in my last visits, I've completely transformed my opinion because the transportation is great, the roads are great, food and beverage is amazing. There is a very large, very cosmopolitan group that actually exists. I don't know. Life is, like I said, apart for air quality, it would be highly attractive.
Yeah. I think one thing that you forgot to mention was the traffic. Do you think India will ever be able to solve the traffic problem?
See,
Or
I
do you
mean,
not see it as a problem?
I think it's a problem, but also like traffic's a problem everywhere in the world. Like it's a problem here in Bay Area, and I have like 6-lane highways, and it's still like backed up. It's a problem. Like I do not remember a single city that I have lived in or visited where traffic is not a problem. Does that
But
make
it's more
It's
chaotic. Like,
worse, perhaps, in some ways, but like it'll get better. Like I think Delhi arguably has gotten much better now than it used to be. And how did it get better? It just built a lot more, a lot more roads, and that helps. Does it help completely? No, because people drive like maniacs, and just building roads does not help because everybody actually wants to buy a car or whatever. The vehicles per square mile of road also kind of goes up somewhat in proportion. So in some sense, that's bad. How does any country actually get around it? They have better public transportation systems. India, arguably, at least in Delhi and in like parts of Kerala, like the trains, the subways they put in are actually pretty good. So it does sort of get around to it. Mumbai always had it with like terrible trains, but like it had better public transportation systems to kind of get around that. But net, I think of it as an equilibrium problem, right? I mean, yeah, the traffic's bad, but people just seem to find slightly different ways to kind of get around it. You know when to get out, you know when to not get out, you know which parts of the city you can go to meet people. You'll find different ways to cut through it. Cities will build whatever ring roads if they can, or other ways of actually commuting, more highways, more freeways. You find different ways to slice through the problem. So traffic exists as an issue, but I can easily imagine a world where India is like 4 times the GDP and still has traffic problems. Because every country in the world has them. So why should India be any different?
yeah, no, I mean, I would say traffic exists, but like the lack of order and chaos, I think will be harder to solve. Perhaps it comes from that same, like, how having safety is more a cultural thing. Perhaps this lack of order on the roads, do you think is also a cultural thing?
It is, right? I mean, I wrote this, one of the essays that I wrote after my last trip was about India being everything happening through bilateral negotiations in India. And it was it was an observation because anytime like traffic is negotiated one-on-one. And if you want orderly traffic flows, it's never anywhere in the world. It's negotiated through top-down rules, right? I know the speed limit. I know what I'm supposed to be driving at. I know the red light. I kind of follow those rules. Whereas in India, it's very much like, no, I want to take a left and this person wants to take a right, and you kind of look at each other and you figure out what the equilibrium between the two of you are, and you forget everybody else as an externality. So that part definitely is a problem. However, I think about other areas where this used to exist. And my perfect example is like flights. Like if you were taking a flight like 10 years ago, 20 years ago, it was much more chaotic. Everything. Boarding was chaotic, sitting inside was chaotic. Like, and today people have kind of figured out like, oh, no. This is just the way things work. And we know where to go and what, like you have a lot more, you have had sufficiently long periods of interaction with the system that you kind of know how to behave in certain circumstances. That you are no longer worried that you're like getting taken advantage of, or like you're getting screwed because of some whatever, because you were not pushy enough. This used to be a problem because like in the previous era, if you spoke loudly enough, you would get the thing that you wanted. Otherwise, you just wouldn't get anything. But to move from that world to like a rule-based order just requires a bit of adjustment. I'm sure it will happen more in traffic as well. It already happens in like freeways, right? If you drive in the larger freeways, it's already far more orderly compared to like if you're driving in downtown Jaipur, where like it's not. So you want that to disseminate slowly throughout larger and larger parts of the ecosystem. And to me, some of that is just a function of like and growth.
Well, that makes sense. But I mean, when I drive around, I don't have so much hope and never get fixed.
I think you're seeing point in time as opposed to like trajectory.
Right. I want to ask you a little bit about your VC and startup area. So, like, do you have any lessons you have learned from like investing, like from your successful and unsuccessful investments?
I mean, this is not a particularly non-obvious lesson, but it's really, really hard to live in a power law world and internalize it. To know that like one of your investments is going to take care of all of the bad investments. It's just intuitively you know it, intellectually you know it, but practically it's really hard to make sense of that. So I think it has made me far more appreciative of higher degrees of optionality, shall we say. To do more things with the hope that one of those things will actually take care of the downside from doing everything else. I think this is a lesson that everybody should know, but I think it's just really hard.
But doesn't that like stretch your resources? Like if you just have too much diversification or optionality, won't it like be like too many resources or too much effort going into different areas?
Yes, like you have to be mindful of how many things that you can actually do and like how much you're actually able to do it 100%. You can't do 200 different things, but on the margins, the number of things that people are doing at any given point is almost always much lesser than what they think they should be doing or what they can do. I mean, just think about in your regular conversations with folks, how many of them talk about like, oh yeah, I have these like, this is an idea that I kind of wanted to do, but it remains this fantasy world that they like tasting in their mouth while they're talking about it, but not actually like push and try to do something with it. So we're still enormously underinvested in converting any one of those things to reality or even trying them out. I think that should be changed.
Valid. Yeah. I think with AI, it will become much more easier to implement ideas. Like now with AI doing so much code, if someone has an idea, they can just prompt it and get the AI build the app or the website.
I mean, I think yes. However, it still remains the case that your return to doing something is higher and the cost of doing something is lower. So you should ideally have more people trying stuff, but you still have to do it. Do you know what I mean? Like it doesn't absolve you of the necessity to actually get off your ass and do something. It makes it slightly easier, so marginally more people will jump in, but it's not like an all or nothing thing. I don't know to what extent the median will shift as opposed to sort of higher agency people now have a lot more tools at their disposal.
I think the higher agency people will be more better off and will be able to benefit during this AI era much more.
I think that's true of the internet era as well. I feel like increasing communication technology over a long period of time has been getting higher agency people to have a better and better life overall. And mostly because of optionality, as opposed to like specific, I managed to go get a Harvard degree kind of issue.
Based on your VC experience, like, what's one piece of advice you wish founders would take more seriously or that they overlook?
I think do something you like is still underrated. Because I feel like a large number of founders, I mean, some people have internalized it and they know what they want to do and kind of go after it. But I think there is enough folks who are trying to do something where they're not entirely sure about the idea or themselves and kind of have somehow found themselves in a place where it becomes one of many projects as opposed to something you actually want to dedicate and build over a period of time. That, and I think the other thing that I would say is like the power of very tiny compounding is heavily underrated. Like every day you should try and do like, a tiny bit better. I think that compounds over 2 years far, far, far more than you would imagine.
Well, that is good advice. Harder to implement, maybe.
I don't know, isn't it easier? Because like you don't need to do much. You just need to do the same thing as you were doing yesterday. Just like make one thing slightly better, or like make like it's almost the other way around of saying like you don't need to go for some crazy. You don't need to have the best idea in the world and the best team in the world and do some insane research breakthrough. You just need to make sure that today is slightly better than yesterday. And sometimes you succeed, sometimes you don't, but at least the direction of travel should be in that direction.
And better like in all areas of life, or is this
You
focused
can
on
choose your metric. I think the metric almost doesn't matter.
what is one belief that perhaps you hold about technology's future that most VCs would disagree with?
A really good question. I don't know the answer, actually. It's something I'll have to think about a little bit. But technology's future that most VCs would disagree with. I wonder. I mean, I think we are entering an era of far more decentralization compared to centralization across everything, across compute, materials, energy, intelligence, you name it. I don't know whether most VCs would disagree with it, but perhaps they would disagree with some of the implications of that because the types of things that you would need to invest in would change because it's no longer investing in pure, network-based growth and competitive advantage and SaaS type investment theses, but it's a different type of beast that you will end up having to invest in.
You've also worked in multiple continents and in multiple countries. Like, what advice do you have like for young professionals who are looking to build like a global career in multiple countries and companies?
Know why you want to do it. I think
Okay.
that would be number one. Otherwise, I did it. I moved to Singapore for studies. Then I moved to London because I like the city. And like now I moved to the Bay Area because I like the Bay and I'm going to be in tech and my wife's from here. So like, I think working in different places is a study in like breaking through your preconceptions of how people work. So in some ways, like you got to be ready for the fact that like, okay, people are pretty much the same everywhere in the world. I would just start with that. Right? Their facades are different, but like there are more similarities than you might expect. But also you get to learn a bunch about the differences in how they think about the world. And to what we started with, it gives you a lot more tools about thinking about the world and like a little bit more insight about how things actually evolve. I think that's useful regardless.
So one final question. Is there any question you are currently wrestling with that you don't have an answer to?
Almost exclusively. I'll give you two of them. One is that I'm trying to figure out a way to kind of make LLMs be able to rate each other such that you can create some sort of an ordered ranking or get them to act better as a judge. I think it's just an interesting problem. I don't have any sort of strong reason to be wrestling with it, but it is a nice, intriguing problem that I would like to find a satisfying answer to. Not necessarily correct, but at least like somewhat satisfying. I think that's one of them. The other one is, well, there's so many in the like hacking around realm, but I'll give you maybe a different one. I'm thinking about the fact that like it is really weird that if you think about the quality of AI writing that actually exists today, it's pretty good, right? Like in many circumstances. But it seems like it is much better at writing quasi-literary works and kind of pastiche of Nabokov or whatever, or even otherwise, its own, compared to writing like a really funny P.G. Wodehouse story or like Nabokov or Terry Pratchett or Douglas Adams. It's much worse at the latter than the former. And I'm not entirely sure why that is the case. I wouldn't have expected it because in my head, I would have thought like, okay, fine, maybe not Woodhouse, but like, can you write a Agatha Christie-like story? And I would have expected the answer to that to be yes before, or the progress to happen towards that before it pushed forward towards writing Lolita. And it can do neither today, just to be very clear. But like, if you think about a one-page output, which one can it actually get closer to? It's clearly on the whatever literary spectrum as opposed to on the genre spectrum. I don't know why that is. I think it's an intriguing question. I feel like there should be an answer to this because it says something fairly deep and interesting about what we find interesting in art. But it's a question that I'm trying to figure out.
On the first question, so you're trying to get the LLM to judge each other. Can you explain more on that?
The hypothesis was that if you actually get LLMs to write their answers and every other LLM to rank each LLM's answers, then you can do something like a page rank. So you can figure out for what types of questions, what LLMs are most reliable, something of that order. The assumption being that if you do something like this, then maybe we can figure out a way whereby you can actually use LLMs as judges to do anything. Even for the second one, where you write an essay, you want to get the LLMs to judge it on sort of some metric. Today, you can't realistically very easily do that because they're not particularly reliable. The question is there some methodology wherein you can figure out how to make them reliable? Hard problem, but it would be interesting if we can find some answers here.
Actually, one final question. Do you have any favorite book? What's your favorite book?
God, in what topic?
Anything that comes to your mind on top.
It's a really hard question because there's enormous amounts of recency bias. I mean, I love Baudelaire Park, obviously, which is why I named the blog after it. I still flip through it once in a while. Other books, I'll give you sort of a slightly underrated one. Anything by Terry Pratchett about Discworld, I think way more people in the world should read. I think it gets often overlooked because it's somehow seen as only satire or funny or whatever. But they're some of the deepest, most humanistic books that have ever been written, and I think more people should read them.
I'll definitely look into it. But thank you so much, Rohit, for taking our time and speaking to me. I really, really appreciate it.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.